When my grandparents passed away, they left their house to me. It wasn't a surprise or some random choice. It was a decision that made perfect sense to everyone who actually knew us. I was more than just their grandson. I was practically their third child. During college, I lived with them instead of staying in a dorm or renting a place. I helped with groceries, doctor's appointments, household repairs, whatever they needed. And after I graduated, I still made time for them, visiting every weekend, calling them throughout the week and making sure they were okay. We had a bond that went beyond family obligations. I genuinely loved spending time with them. My brother Lucas was the complete opposite. As we grew up, he slowly drifted away, prioritizing his own life over family. He wasn't a bad person, just distant. Work, friends, and later his wife and kids became his world. That would have been fine if he had at least made an effort to stay connected, but he barely did. In the last 5 years of their lives, my grandparents saw him twice. And both times, it was because of a major holiday where he had no choice but to show up. They noticed. They didn't complain out loud, but I could tell it hurt them. They never said, "We're leaving the house to you because Lucas doesn't deserve it," but I knew. They saw who was there for them and who wasn't. When they finalized their will, I wasn't shocked to see my name on the deed. After their passing, I kept the house. It wasn't just a piece of property to me, it was a place filled with memories. I had no intention of selling it, and I definitely never imagined it becoming a source of conflict. But then Lucas came back into the picture, and suddenly he had a lot to say about the house he had never cared about before. Lucas and I were never particularly close growing up. We had different interests, different priorities. He was always the social one, the one who made friends easily and was rarely home. I was quieter, more reserved. When I moved in with our grandparents during college, that distance between us only grew. At first, I thought it was just life pulling us in different directions, but as time went on, I started realizing that Lucas wasn't just busy. He was absent, completely. Our grandparents never demanded much from either of us. They didn't expect us to spend every weekend with them or call them daily, but they did hope to see us, to feel like they were still part of our lives. I saw that hope fade every time Lucas failed to show up for a visit, every time he promised to come by and then canceled last minute. I remember one particular afternoon when my grandmother was setting the table for lunch. She made an extra plate, just in case Lucas decided to stop by. He had told her earlier that week that he might come. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but I could tell she was excited. She kept glancing at the clock, checking her phone. Hours passed, and eventually she sighed, packed up the extra plate, and placed it in the fridge. "He must be busy," she said, forcing a smile. "Next time." But there was never a next time. The truth was, Lucas had moved on. He built his own life, started his own family, and seemed to forget about the people who raised us. And now, after years of barely acknowledging our grandparents, he suddenly cared about them. Or rather, he cared about what they had left behind. I hadn't heard much from Lucas after our grandparents passed. We spoke occasionally, usually about surface-level things, how work was going, how his kids were doing. But there was never any real depth to our conversations. So when he suddenly invited me over for coffee one afternoon, I knew something was up. We sat in his cramped apartment, his 2 kids playing noisily in the background, while his wife, Fernanda, gave me a polite but distant smile before disappearing into the other room. Lucas didn't waste time with small talk. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and got straight to the point. "I think you should give me the house." I almost laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his expression was dead serious. He explained that they were struggling. Their apartment was too small, the rent was eating up their income, and with 2 kids they needed more space. He talked about how hard things had been, how expensive everything was, and how much better life would be if they had a real home. I listened, waiting for some kind of punchline or a hint that this was a negotiation. Maybe he wanted to rent the house or buy it on a payment plan. But no, he truly expected me to just hand it over. "You don't even need it," he added, as if that justified everything. "You don't have kids, you're doing fine on your own. Meanwhile, I have a family to take care of." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around his entitlement. He had barely spoken to our grandparents while they were alive, and now he felt entitled to their home, a home they had chosen to leave to me. I took a deep breath and said, as calmly as I could. "No, Lucas, the house isn't yours." His jaw tightened, and I could see the frustration brewing behind his eyes. But he wasn't done yet. Lucas stared at me like I had just insulted him. His fingers curled into fists, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. Instead, he let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Seriously?" he scoffed. "You're really saying no?" "Yes," I said simply. He sat back, rubbing his hands over his face in frustration. "Come on, man. You don't even need it. It's just sitting there." Meanwhile, I'm breaking my back trying to keep a roof over my kids' heads. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. "You have no idea what it's like," he continued, voice growing more desperate. "To worry about whether your kids will have a stable home. You don't have children, you don't understand." That hit a nerve, but I kept my expression neutral. "That house was left to me for a reason," I said. "You barely visited them, Lucas. They made their choice." His jaw clenched. "They would have wanted it to go to the person who needed it most." I shook my head. "If that were true, they would have left it to you. But they didn't." His face darkened, and I could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He wasn't used to me standing my ground, and he clearly didn't like it. "So that's it?" he snapped. "You're just going to hoard a house you don't need while your own brother struggles?" I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm not hoarding anything. The house was left to me, end of discussion." Lucas's expression hardened. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his coffee cup in the process. "Fine," he muttered, "if that's how you want to be." I could tell by the look in his eyes that this wasn't over. I should have known Lucas wouldn't drop it. A few days after our conversation, I got a call from our mom. The moment I answered, I could hear the tension in her voice. "I just got off the phone with your brother," she said. "He told me what happened." I sighed, already knowing where this was going. "Sweetheart, I need you to think about this carefully," she continued. "Lucas is struggling. He has 2 kids. He needs that house more than you do." I pinched the bridge of my nose, trying to stay patient. "Mom, the house was left to me. I'm not giving it away just because Lucas suddenly wants it." She sighed, as if I were being difficult on purpose. "I'm not saying you should just hand it over, but could you at least consider selling it to him? You could give him a family discount, help him out a little." There it was, her way of making it sound reasonable. I knew how my mom operated. She wasn't outright demanding, but she was laying the guilt on thick. She had always been the peacemaker, the one trying to keep the family together at any cost. And in her mind, family first meant I should be willing to sacrifice for Lucas. "Mom," I said firmly, "if I ever sell that house, it'll be for market price. I'm not giving Lucas special treatment." She inhaled sharply, clearly unhappy with my answer. "So money is more important than your own brother?" I clenched my jaw. "That's not what this is about, and you know it." She was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "I just don't want to see my family divided over something like this." "Then maybe tell Lucas to stop demanding things that were never his to begin with." Silence. Then a disappointed, "I really thought you'd do the right thing." The call ended, but the weight of her words lingered. I knew my mother wasn't happy with me, but I didn't expect Lucas to come back so soon. Just a day after her call, he showed up at my door. I barely had time to process my frustration before he was standing in my living room, arms crossed, eyes full of expectation. "Okay," he said, like we were negotiating some kind of deal. "If you won't give me the house, at least sell it to me. And don't hit me with some ridiculous market price. Be reasonable." I exhaled slowly. "Lucas, I already told Mom. If I ever sell the house, it will be for market value." His expression darkened. "You're really going to make me pay full price? Your own brother? When you know I can't afford it?" "That's not my problem," I said, my patience wearing thin. Lucas let out a humorless laugh. "Wow, so it's all about money to you?" "No, it's about respect," I shot back. "Respect for the decision our grandparents made. Respect for the fact that I was there for them while you weren't. And respect for the fact that I don't owe you anything." His jaw tightened. "They wouldn't have wanted you to do this." I felt something snap inside me. "You think you know what they would have wanted? You barely even saw them, Lucas. Maybe if you had visited more than twice in 5 years, they would have left you something too." His face twisted in anger, and for a second I thought he might actually lunge at me. Instead, he just shook his head, disgusted. "You're unbelievable." "No," I said, my voice cold. "What's unbelievable is you suddenly caring about our grandparents now that there's something to gain." Lucas turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I expected some relief, but instead, I just felt drained. Something told me this wasn't over. I barely had time to process my argument with Lucas before my phone started blowing up. My mother, an aunt, even a couple of cousins, everyone had something to say. Apparently, Lucas had wasted no time telling the family his version of events. By the time I answered my mom's call, she was already mid-rant. "That was cruel," she said, skipping any greeting. "Telling your brother he wasn't left anything because he didn't visit? How could you say that to him?" I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples. "Mom, it's the truth. He barely saw them, and now he wants their house like he's entitled to it. He's struggling," she shot back. "You don't understand what it's like to have children to provide for. He's doing his best." I clenched my jaw. Doing his best? He had years to be there for them, and he didn't bother. Now that there's something valuable involved, suddenly he wants to play the family card. She sighed, frustrated. "It's not about the house. It's about doing the right thing." "No," I said, my voice steady. "Doing the right thing would have been Lucas visiting his grandparents when they were alive, instead of acting like they didn't exist." Silence. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, more controlled. "You're tearing this family apart over a house." I let out a sharp breath. "No, Mom. Lucas is the one making this a problem. I didn't take anything from him. He just doesn't like the fact that he didn't get what he wanted." More silence. Then, in a quiet but firm voice, she said, "I just hope you can live with yourself after this." The call ended before I could respond. I stared at my phone, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. I wasn't the one causing this mess, but somehow I was the villain in their eyes. And the worst part? A small part of me started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were right. The fallout was worse than I expected. Word spread fast, and soon enough, the entire family had an opinion. Some were on my side, saying the house was rightfully mine, and that Lucas was acting entitled. Others, mostly the ones closer to my mum, thought I was being selfish and heartless. I got messages from cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly telling me I should be the bigger person. An uncle texted me saying that family was more important than property. Another relative told me I was disrespecting my mother by going against her wishes. I tried ignoring it, but it was hard not to feel like I was being backed into a corner. Every conversation, every message had the same undertone. Why couldn't I just give in? Lucas, of course, played the victim. He told everyone he was just a struggling father trying to give his kids a better life, and I was the cold-hearted brother, hoarding a house I didn't even need. He conveniently left out the part where he ignored our grandparents for years. At a family dinner, one I wasn't even invited to, he broke down in tears, saying he didn't know how he was going to keep affording rent. My mother, ever the dramatic one, told everyone that I had turned my back on my own brother. I found out about it later through a cousin who was there. "They made you sound like some kind of villain," she said over the phone. "Like you're keeping the house just to spite him." I scoffed. "Do any of them care that he ignored our grandparents when they were alive?" She hesitated. "I mean, people just feel bad for him, you know? He's got kids, and you don't." I hung up before I could say something I'd regret. It was clear now. This wasn't about fairness, it was about guilt, and they were all determined to make me carry it. Despite knowing I was right, the constant pressure started to wear me down. Everywhere I turned, someone had something to say about the situation. I couldn't even check my phone without seeing a new message or missed call from a relative. Was I being too harsh? Was I really prioritizing a house over my own brother's well-being? I found myself replaying old memories, our childhood, the times when Lucas and I actually got along. Before life got complicated, before he drifted away, I thought about his kids, about how none of this was their fault. Would selling the house to him at a discount really be such a big deal? Then I thought about my grandparents, about how my grandmother had waited at the table with an extra plate that was never needed. About all the times they asked me if Lucas was going to visit and I had to make excuses for him. They had made their choice. They had left the house to me for a reason, and now, instead of respecting their decision, my family was trying to guilt me into giving it up. I exhaled slowly, gripping my phone tightly as another call from my mom flashed across the screen. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't going to change my mind. Not because I was selfish, but because I had already done my part. I had been there. I had cared. Lucas wasn't entitled to my sacrifices just because he suddenly needed them. But if that was true, why did I still feel like the bad guy? At this point, I had made my decision. I wasn't giving up the house, and I wasn't going to let my family guilt me into it. But that didn't stop the tension. Lucas wasn't speaking to me anymore. My mother was disappointed, making sure I knew it every time we talked. Some relatives had outright sided with him, while others told me privately that they understood but didn't want to get involved. The family felt divided, and whether I liked it or not, I was at the center of it. But the truth is, I don't think Lucas ever wanted the house because it was special to him. He wanted it because it was convenient, because it would solve his problems without him having to work for it. And when that didn't happen, he made me the villain. Maybe if he had visited our grandparents more, things would have been different. Maybe if he had shown them the same care I did, they would have considered leaving something to him. But he didn't, and now he was facing the consequences of his own choices. Still, part of me wonders, should I have handled it differently? Should I have been more understanding? Should I have made some kind of compromise just to keep the peace? Or was I right to stand my ground even if it meant losing the family I was trying to protect? So what do you think? Am I the asshole,